series, and we are being recorded. Um, just a brief announcement before we get started. This is the concluding session of the speaker series for fall quarter, and we'll reconvene again on January 13th with a presentation on workforce development policy in California featuring Sarah Hinckley from UC Berkeley and Michael Bernick, who's a former director of the Employment Development Department for the state of California. But as for today's program, we're really honored to have John A. Perez with us. As you know, he's chair of the UC Board of Regents and Speaker Emeritus of the California Assembly. As chair of the University of California Board of Regents, Mr. Perez has prioritized providing an elite education without elite barriers that keep qualified students out, making sure that the UC student body better reflects the people of California, and keeping the cost of education affordable, equitable, and predictable. Mr. Perez was appointed to the Board of Regents in 2014 and was elected chair in May 2019. His commitment to public education goes back to his days as a student and activist at UC Berkeley and continued during his service in the California legislature. He was elected to the Assembly in 2008, represented downtown Los Angeles and East LA surrounding communities, and became Speaker in 2010. In the Assembly, Regent Perez made affordability and accessibility of higher education a statewide priority. And among his legislative achievements is one that remains influential now, passage of the Middle Class Scholarship Act, which has provided up to 40% tuition relief for nearly 100,000 UC and CSU students throughout the state. Prior to his service in the Assembly, he was political director for the California Labor Federation. He's also been active in national politics, serving as president of the National Legislative Speakers Conference and a member of the President's Commission on HIV/AIDS for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. So during this session, Regent Perez will speak for about 20 minutes, sharing views and perhaps stories derived from his unique experience as a California legislator, speaker, regent, and chair, and we'll then open up the floor for questions and discussion. There's two ways for you to interact with Regent Perez. The best way is simply raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand feature, and one of our center staff will call on you. As an alternative, you can type your question into the Q&A slot, but live questions will take priority. And so with that, I'm delighted to introduce Speaker Emeritus and Chair of the UC Regents, John A. Perez.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. And quite frankly, I'm about the most unlikely person to occupy the seats that I have had over the last dozen or so years. I grew up in a California that was demographically very similar to the California of today, but politically was very different. I grew up in a California that didn't have broad-based representation of folks at all levels of political office. In fact, there were only a handful of Latinos in the state legislature when I was growing up, and there had never been an openly LGBT member of the legislature. Growing up, in fact, there was only one openly LGBT elected official that I had ever heard of. That was Harvey Milk, and his assassination did very little to make me think that we would ever achieve the level of representation that we do today. So growing up, well, I was always politically active, worked on my first political campaign when I was 14 years old, and really never stopped since. I always thought that my role would be behind the scenes helping other people get elected. In fact, my first trip to Sacramento and my first trip to the Capitol was the summer when I was 16 years old and I was participating in the American Legion Boys State program. There's a Netflix movie about Boys State in Texas that's out there right now for those of you who are unfamiliar with Boys State. But that opportunity brought me to the Capitol and gave me a different sense of participatory democracy. And for the first time, I stepped foot into the chambers of the Assembly and I was in awe, stepping on the green carpet and thinking that so many fundamental decisions about California had been made and had been debated on that very floor. but I never thought that I would come back to serve in that chamber or, in fact, to be speaker. So I was about as surprised as anybody in 2008 when I decided to run for the assembly, won handily, and got sworn in December 1st, 2008, only to realize that we were really dealing with the depths of the greatest economic challenge since the Great Depression. The state was in a $60 billion deficit out of a $120 billion budget. So literally 50% of our finances were in deficit. California was thought to be ungovernable at the time. And 3 times in my first year in the assembly, the state was within days of going off the fiscal cliff and being declared insolvent. For those who don't remember these times well, remember at that time, cities and counties across the country dealt with insolvency, and it was very likely that California was going to go off the fiscal cliff. Globally, we were compared to Greece, which was dealing with similar challenges. And it was thought that we would not be able to recover. And so clearly we bounced back, and I'll get to that in a bit. But when I got elected, I was the first openly gay person of color ever elected to state office, and only one of 2 LGBT folks in the legislature. It was me and Tom Amiano from San Francisco. And so we were going about our normal business, or what we thought was normal, having legislative sessions in our first month that ran 32 hours, 36 hours, 28 hours, trying to deal with the significant challenges of the Great Recession. And in our first full year in office in 2009, we passed not 1, but 2 budgets. One that was optimistic and that also put questions before the voters about some short-term tax increases that we thought could get the state through the challenges of the Great Recession. We underestimated things like the housing meltdown, but it was an optimistic budget. It didn't incentivize the voters to approve those short-term taxes. Maybe nothing could have at that point. So again, later in the year, we passed a second budget to balance the state, but it was loaded with very tough decisions, made even more difficult by the fact that California was only one of 3 states in the country that required a supermajority to pass a budget. It was California, Rhode Island, and Arkansas. And California was nothing like Rhode Island or Arkansas in terms of political structure, or quite frankly, in terms of size or global scope. So it was really something that sounded fair on the outset, but created huge challenges to governing. In fact, when one of those budgets was passed, it was so difficult that first year to put together a bipartisan supermajority. And California was the only supermajority that, in fact, needed to be bipartisan given representation at the time. Rhode Island had a supermajority of Democrats, Arkansas, a supermajority of Republicans. But the work was so hard that the 4 legislative leaders who crafted that budget with then Governor Schwarzenegger went on to receive the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award for the way in which they made very difficult decisions in a bipartisan way at the depths of an economic challenge. On the 1-year anniversary of my being sworn into the Assembly on December 1st of 2009, I put together the votes to become Speaker very early. Most people get to be Speaker much later in their career than I had. But because of term limits and because of a variety of other reasons, my colleagues thought I was the right person to lead the chamber during the next phase of the crisis. And when I was sworn in as Speaker, we were now down to about a $28 billion deficit, but still a significant deficit. But again, as I said, I was the first openly gay person of color in the legislature. I was the first gay person in the country to lead a state legislature anywhere in the United States. There were 3 other folks who followed within the year after I was elected Speaker. But this brings me up to an interesting point. When we were in the summer of 2009, Tom Amiano and I were looking around at all the events that were occurring on the floor of the Capitol. There was African American History Month and Asian Pacific Islander History Month and Irish American History Month, but there was no longer a gay pride celebration that had been started around 1996. And so we went to my predecessor Speaker, now Congresswoman Karen Bass, and we asked her why there wasn't a gay pride celebration. And she said that a few years back during the last Pride celebration, uh, the entirety of the Republican caucus in the assembly stood up, walked to the front of the chambers and out the side door because they didn't want to be seen honoring LGBT folks on the floor of the Capitol, and that it was quite an embarrassing event. And as a result of that, it had been canceled. So Tom and I asked to bring it back. We were asked if we were afraid of embarrassing our honorees, and we said we didn't think they should be embarrassed. It's folks who walked out of the door who should have been embarrassed. And so we brought it back, and we went and talked to several of our Republican colleagues, and a handful of them agreed to stay on the floor and observe the ceremony. It was a significant step for them, and it was one that was not easy, but was meaningful. And so we brought back that Pride celebration. When I ran for speaker, some folks tried to use, and both on the Democratic and Republican side, my sexual orientation as a reason for folks not to vote for me. Clearly, it wasn't a compelling enough argument. I won an overwhelming vote to be speaker. But remembering that experience with the gay pride celebrations and folks going out the front side door of the chambers to avoid recognizing LGBT folks, I thought I'd do a little something special. And I invited the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles to fly up quietly to Sacramento and perform in the chambers. In the program, it didn't list them. It just said special musical performance. And so they came into the Capitol. We hid them off in different parts of the Capitol. And as all the members came onto the floor, we brought them into the side hall that had been the escape route in the past. And they lined that back hall. And at a certain moment, they were introduced as the special musical performance. And you could see people fidgeting in their chairs, uncomfortable by the fact that they were going to be listening to the Gay Men's Chorus on this day. And I had them sing a medley of God Bless America and America the Beautiful, because in doing that, nobody could avoid applauding or standing at the appropriate moment. And they did a spectacular job of singing that medley. And when they were done, everybody was applauding, some with more vigor than others. And everybody thought it was over. And then I had the chorus do the song Brand New Day from the musical The Wiz. And once the point had been made, we went on to proceed with the rest of the swearing in and talked about the priorities of changing the structural way in which we govern, how we prioritize taking care of folks that were most directly impacted by the Great Recession, how we looked at ways to work together, but also how we needed to make sure that we were accountable and created the reforms that were necessary to get California to the next stage. In the next several months, it was all about budget negotiations, again, dealing with this $28 billion deficit that was still left with us. And with a requirement for a bipartisan supermajority, much of the budget was negotiated behind closed doors in a group that was called the Big Five. It was the Speaker of the Assembly, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, the minority leaders of both houses, and the governor. So while Democrats controlled 60%, 60+% of the seats in both houses, when you got to negotiate the budget, 60% of the seats around the negotiating table was Republicans. It made it very difficult. And in fact, oftentimes budgets in the past were late, and almost always late. And oftentimes they included policy decisions that had nothing to do with the budget, because it was the one place where a minority party could exercise their power to get outcomes that they wanted. And so we had a very long fight. The governor proposed cuts that I thought were excessive and that didn't take into effect the impacts on employment in the state of California. And so looking back at my experience as a labor leader, I thought it wasn't enough to reject what the governor proposed, but instead to have a counter proposal. And so we developed something called the California Jobs Budget. It was a budget construct that looked not only at balancing a budget, but it is now analyzing every budgetary decision, not just for its impact on the bottom line, but for its impact on jobs. Because at that point, California had the highest recorded rate of unemployment we had ever had, and the second highest rate in the country. So solving for jobs was a huge element. We did something that at the time was technologically cutting edge. We started webcasting our budget hearings. We started going around the state and webcasting the budget hearings and giving the participants clickers where they could weigh in and tell us if they liked our idea or the governor's idea more. And we didn't do it the cheap way. We didn't just go to base Democratic districts. We went to swing districts in the Inland Empire and the Central Valley. We went to base districts as well because we wanted to actually get real information about how folks felt about a variety of these different proposals. In the end, it was the longest budget negotiation in the history of California. It was over 120 days past the constitutional deadline that we actually adopted the budget that year. And at the same time, we had put a question before the voters to move California from a supermajority to passing a budget to a simple majority. And we put a hook in there that said if the legislature failed to pass a balanced budget on time, that the legislature would be docked its pay until, in fact, they did pass a balanced budget. So that year, longest, latest budget debate in the history of the state, but it was balanced. And then the voters passed the constitutional amendment to make California like the other 48 states, 47 states, with only a simple majority to pass a budget. And as a result, each of the next years, we passed on-time balanced budgets. In fact, the next 3 budgets I passed was the first time in decades that the state had passed on-time balanced budgets back to back. As a result of that, it improved the credit worthiness of the state of California. We had better bond ratings. In the second year of those improved budget negotiations, the savings in the finance costs alone resulted in $1.9 billion of savings to the state of California in that 1 year. We took a portion of that, $500,000, and divided equally between CSU and UC as a reinvestment in higher education, because higher education had taken a disproportionate hit in previous bad budget years. But I looked at this and said, if we're going to do structural fixes, it's not enough to just do the structural fix of how you pass the budget, but it was important to do a structural fix for how you manage resources that come into the state. And so first in 2010 and then again in 2011, I tried and failed in 2010. I tried and succeeded in 2011. We created a rainy day fund. And we took all the spiking revenues for the state and the first 1.5% of revenues, regardless of whether it was spiking, and put it away in a rainy day fund and locked up the most of it for difficult budget times, allowed a little bit of it to be used for dealing with intractable long-term debt. And as of last year, we had built that rainy day fund to over $17 billion, as well as having paid down billions of dollars of other debt because of the way in which we crafted the rainy day fund. In fact, when you look at the current COVID budgetary challenges of the state, over a 4 to 5 year period, the anticipated hit on the state of California is $54 billion. So the $17 billion in the rainy day fund is 1/3 of all the solutions necessary for the immediate crisis facing the state today. It's why the state was able to make a variety of decisions to stretch out the solutions because of COVID, because we put the state in a fundamentally better place financially, and because we had tools like the rainy day fund that we left. Now, the other interesting thing during my time is in 2010, I was the only Democratic legislative leader in the country to not only re-elect every member of my body, but actually grow my majority. Everywhere else around the state, Democrats lost their majorities or lost the percentage of their majority. We grew it. And in 2012, it was the first time in 140 years that we had a bicameral supermajority and laid the foundation for the supermajorities that have happened since then. That's brought good and bad. So when you have a supermajority, how do you make sure that the minority party still has a significant role in governing? Well, one of the things I did in 2010 after the election, and again after the 2012 supermajority election, is I named Republican committee chairs, 2 1 year, 1 the other. Why? Because if you want people to be partners in governing, they have to have some skin in the game. They have to be able to make decisions. They have to be able to control part of the discourse as well. So a supermajority that ignores the minority fails to do its job fully. It's nice to have more votes. It's important to have all perspectives heard in the debate. Of course, I want to get my way, but it's more important to get my way if we actually have had a legitimate debate where everybody's got a say in the decisions, and then we hold people accountable and we put up a vote. That brings me to what we have now. Very tough housekeeping challenges for both houses of the legislature. It was tough enough when I had 55 Democrats, but now that the Assembly Speaker has 60, the Senate President Pro Tem has well over 30, being able to figure out how you divvy up responsibilities and roles is incredibly difficult, and it makes it harder to govern at certain points. So I do not envy the increased supermajorities that the two members of leadership have right now. Even simple things like divvying up offices. I remember in 2012 thinking in one seat that a Republican had won, and only the night before swearing in, finding out that with a late vote count, a Democrat had won. I had already assigned all the offices, assigned all the seats on the floor, and printed out the program for swearing in the next day. And so that night, I went to the Capitol with a handful of staff. We were literally with staple removers taking out the inserts of the program so we could print new programs with the right names. We were rewiring the desks on the floor to make sure that we had the correct name assigned to the seat so that on the vote board, it had the right member's name. I had to personally go and crawl, on hands and knees in the office to rewire the computer to accommodate the staff of the new Democratic member. And on the board with all the pictures of the members in the hallway, we had to search the internet to find a picture of this new member that nobody thought was going to be sworn in. The logistical nightmare of transition is always difficult, but it's even more complicated by the vast supermajorities that the Speaker and the Senate President Pro Tem are dealing with now. So as we improved the economic and structural challenges facing the state, what did we do? What did we prioritize? How did we focus? Well, one of the things that we did in those years that the state is really benefiting from now is looked at the way people engaged in commerce. So I created the Governor's Office of Business Development, GoBiz, so that there'd be a centralized force within state government focusing on how you build and support businesses, how you build and support trade and commerce. It's not yet perfect, but it's a better tool than the state had in a long time. Second, we looked at things like how people were using online technology for purchasing. Up until that time, if you made a purchase online, in addition to the online purveyor not having to pay for bricks and mortar, they didn't have to transmit sales tax to the state of California. And so now Senator Nancy Skinner, then Assemblyman Chuck Calderon, and then Senator Hancock, wrote two pieces of legislation so that the state collects sales tax from online sales. I will tell you, during COVID, if the state of California wasn't getting the online sales tax that resulted from that change that we did then, we'd be in a much worse situation than we are today. We created, as Dr. Kravitz said, the middle class scholarship to make college more affordable and more accessible. And looking at the healthcare challenges facing the country then, and much of the healthcare challenges facing us now, I was proud to be the author of the legislation that created Covered California as the first health benefit exchange in the state of California. And for those of you who are under 26, still on your parents' health insurance, that was made possible through this health benefit exchange. And again, COVID showed how important it was to have this exchange because the number of folks enrolled in Covered California has gone up dramatically as people's work and business situations have changed. So it was taking on big challenges and then trying to create structural reform so that we would be in a better place on the back end of the challenge than we were at the front end of the challenge, which is really the message for incoming legislators today. I just got done writing a letter to all the new members of the legislature who get sworn in next week, reminding them that they have to focus on the challenge before them, the direct and indirect impacts of COVID. But if they only look at the immediate challenge and don't look at what they want to build on the back end, then they'll have wasted a great opportunity. And so I'm incredibly optimistic that California is in a wonderful place to weather the storm of the challenges before us and to build a structurally better set of realities. I'm also proud, as the chair of the UC Board of Regents, of how the university has responded to the pandemic. I'm proud of how UC has contributed so much to finding creative solutions to the challenges that we face. The UC Berkeley biochemistry students who manufactured hand sanitizer at the beginning of the crisis. The UCSF medical personnel who volunteered to go to Queens and the Navajo Nation to assist healthcare workers there to bring lessons back to California during the first spike. The UC Santa Barbara and UC San Diego engineers who are designing 3D printer face shields and ventilators, and the UC Riverside theater employees who are sewing face masks. The Davis students and staff who are partnering with the YOLO Food Bank to deliver food to those in need. The UC San Francisco students who are babysitting for their colleagues while their colleagues are doing extended shifts. The researchers across all of our campuses who are doing the critical work of finding antiviral drugs and therapeutics and the role that we've played in vaccines to conquer the virus. The UC staff rapidly transitioned from their normal lives to working remotely and are keeping the university running. The faculty quickly converted to teaching online, entailing many hours of preparation and planning to go into designing online courses. And in fact, the way in which we've approached repopulating our campuses, even as courses are primarily online, each of our campuses have students who are living on campus, most aggressively at UC San Diego for a variety of reasons. But we've prioritized repopulating our dorms to the degree that we can, first with those who would benefit the most from being in the dorms. Former foster youth who have no other home to go to, folks who live in multi-generational housing, who need the space in the dorm to be able to focus and succeed in their schoolwork. We have really dealt very well with many of these challenges, and we've got a lot more to learn. But the most important lesson for us is to looking at the holistic impact of the crisis on our students, on our staff, and on our faculty, not having an overly siloed approach, because in moments of crisis, we need to look at the totality of impacts on people. I will take that as a way to end my formal comments and use the balance of the time to engage in questions and whatever other discussions you all want to engage in. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chair Perez, for just a wonderful talk today. And so I'm going to go ahead and have Brooke go ahead and stop our recording.